The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. In a lime green light. Even in his nausea he could not help wondering what it was that Abiathar Swelter was doing. He raised his head from the wall and brought it by degrees to its former position. This time Flay was surprised to find that the room appeared empty, but, with a start at its dreadful nearness, he found that the chef was sitting on a bench against the wall and immediately below him. It was not easy to see him clearly through the filth and cobwebs of the window, but the great pasty dome of his head, surrounded by the lamp-tinted whiteness of his swollen clothes, seemed, when Flay located them, almost at arm's length. This proximity injected into Mr. Flay's bones a sensation of exquisite horror. He stood, fascinated at the pulpy boldness of the chef's cranium, and as he stared, a portion of its pale plush contracted in a spasm, dislodging an October fly. Nothing else moved. Mr. Flay's eyes shifted for a moment, and he saw a grindstone against the wall opposite. Beside it was a wooden stool. To his right, he saw 2 boxes placed about 4 feet apart. On either side of these wooden boxes, 2 chalk lines ran roughly parallel to each other and passed laterally along the room below Mr. Flay. Nearing the left-hand wall of the room, they turned to the right, keeping the same space between them, but in their new direction they could not proceed for more than a few feet before being obstructed by the wall. At this point something had been written between them in chalk, and an arrow pointed towards the wall. The writing was hard to read, but after a moment Flay deciphered it as, "To the 9th stairs." This reading of the chalk came as a shock to Mr. Flay, if only for the reason that the 9th stairs were those by which Lord Sepulchre's bedroom was reached from the door below. His eyes returned swiftly to the rough globe of a head beneath him, but there was still no movement except perhaps the slight vibration of the chef's breathing. Flay turned his eyes again to the right, where the 2 boxes were standing, and he now realized that they represented either a door or an entrance of some sort from which led this chalked passageway before it returned to the right in the direction of the 9th stairs. But it was upon a long sack which had at first failed to attract his attention that he now focused his eyes. It lay as though curled up immediately between and a little in advance of the 2 boxes. As he scrutinized it, something terrified him, something nameless, and which he had not yet had time to comprehend, but something from which he recoiled. A movement below him plucked his eyes from the sack, and a huge shape arose. It moved across the room, the whiteness of the enveloping clothes tinctured by the lime-green lamp above. It sat beside the grindstone. It held in its hand what seemed, in the proportion to its bulk, a small weapon, but which was in reality a 2-handed cleaver. Swelter's feet began to move the treadles of the grindstone, and it began to spin in its circles. He spat upon it rapidly 3 or 4 times in succession, and with a quick movement slid the already razor-keen edge of the cleaver across the whir of the stone. Doubling himself over the grindstone, he peered at the shivering edge of the blade, and every now and then lifted it to his ear as though to listen for a thin and singing note to take flight from the unspeakable sharpness of the steel. Then again he bent to his task and continued whetting the blade for several minutes before listening once more to the invisible edge. Flay began to lose contact with the reality of what he saw and his brain to drift into a dream, when he found that the chef was drawing himself upwards and travelling to that part of the wall where the chalk lines ended and where the arrow pointed to the 9th staircase. Then he removed his shoes and lifted his face for the first time so that Mr. Flay could see the expression that seeped from it. His eyes were metallic and murderous, but the mouth hung open in a wide, fatuous smile. Then followed what appeared to Flay an extraordinary dance, a grotesque ritual of the legs, and it was some time before he realized, as the cook advanced by slow, elaborate steps between the chalk lines, that he was practicing tiptoeing with absolute silence. "What's he practicing that for?" thought Flay, watching the intense and painful concentration with which Swelter moved forward step by step, the cleaver shining in his right hand. Flay glanced again at the chalk arrow. "He's come from the 9th staircase. He's turned left down the worn passage. There's no rooms right or left in the worn passage. I ought to know. He's approaching the room." In the darkness, Flay turned as white as death. The 2 boxes could represent only one thing: the doorposts of Lord Sepulchre's bedroom, and the sack. He watched the chef approach the symbol of himself asleep outside his master's room, curled up as he always was. By now the tardiness of the approach was unendingly slow. The feet in their thick soles would descend an inch at a time, and as they touched the ground, the figure cocked his head of lard upon one side, and his eyes rolled upwards as he listened for his own footfall. When within 3 feet of the sack, the chef raised the cleaver in both hands and edged his feet forward, one after the other, in little, noiseless shiftings. He had now judged the distance between himself and the sleeping emblem of his hate. Flay shut his eyes as he saw the cleaver rise in the air above the cumulus shoulder, and the steel flared in the green light. When he opened his eyes again, Abiathar Swelter was no longer by the sack, which appeared to be exactly as he had last seen it. He was at the chalk arrow again and was creeping forward as before. The horror that had filled Flay was aggravated by a question that had entered his mind. How did Swelter know that he slept with his chin at his knees? How did Swelter know his head always pointed to the east? Had he been observed during his sleeping hours? Flay pressed his face to the window for the last time. The dreadful repetition of the same murderous tiptoeing journey towards the sack struck such a blow at the very centre of his nervous control that his knees gave way and he sank to his haunches on the barrel and wiped the back of his hand across his forehead. Suddenly his only thought was of escape from a region of the castle that could house such a fiend, to escape from that window of green light. And, scrambling from the cask, he stumbled into the mist-filled darkness, and, never turning his head again to the scene of horror, made tracks for the archway from whence he had deviated so portentously from his course. Once within the building, he made directly for the main stairs, and with gigantic paces climbed like a mantis to the floor in which Nanny Slag's room was situated. It was some time before he came to her door, for the west wing in which she lived was on the opposite side of the building and necessitated a detour through many halls and corridors. She was not in her room, and so he went at once to Lady Fuchsia's, where, as he had surmised, he found her sitting by the fire with little of the deference which he felt she should display in front of his lordship's daughter. It was when he had knocked at the door of the room with the knuckly single rap that he had wakened Fuchsia from her sleep and startled the old nurse. Before he had knocked on the panels, he had stood several minutes recovering his composure as best he could. In his mind emerged the picture of himself striking Swelter across the face with a chain, long ago as it seemed to him now, in the cool room. For a moment he started sweating again, and he wiped his hands down his sides before he entered. His throat felt very dry, and even before noticing Lady Fuchsia and the nurse he had seen the tray. That was what he wanted. Something to drink. He left the room with a steadier step, and, saying that he would await Mrs. Slag and Titus under the archway and escort her to the library, he left them.